Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My apologies for the delay in our start. We had an evacuation in one of the buildings we're in, and so that's sort of thrown things into a bit of disarray. So here we are. We're 10 minutes late, but we're up and running. My name's Michael Fotheringham. I'm the Managing Director of AHURI, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the AHURI Research Webinar Series once again today. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that I'm hosting this webinar from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and also to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which each of you are working today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people participating in this webinar. And I pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and celebrate the diversity of Aboriginal peoples and their ongoing cultures and connections to the lands and waters throughout Australia. Now, AHURI is pleased to continue our webinar series in 2021 after launching it in trying circumstances last year. And I'm happy to say that our research webinar program will continue throughout 2021, even as our public event program starts to recommence. Before I introduce today's topic and speakers, I'll just need to provide you with a few instructions on the software and some housekeeping. The webinar is being recorded, so if you want to return to it later or forward it on to a colleague, the recording will be on the AHURI website in the next few days. And at the end of today's webinar, you'll receive a survey from us. We genuinely welcome your feedback so that we can refine and improve future webinars to ensure that we're presenting information in a manner that's useful to you. In terms of participating in today's webinar, some simple instructions. You'll have the opportunity to submit questions by typing them in the Q&A section just to the right of the presentation screen. And you can submit your questions at any time during the presentation. I'd encourage you to get in early. We'll collate those and address as many of them as we can during the Q&A segment following today's presentation. So today I'm delighted to welcome you to the webinar, Urban Productivity and Affordable Rental Housing Supply. Our presenter today is Professor Nicole Gurran from the University of Sydney. Nicole's the lead author of the AHURI report, Urban Productivity and Affordable Rental Housing Supply in Australian Cities and Regions, which examines the relationships between urban productivity and affordable rental housing. The report, along with a policy evidence summary and a standalone executive summary, are all now available on the AHURI website, as well as in the handout sections to the right of your screen. So Nicole Gurran is a Professor of Urban and Regional Planning at the University of Sydney, which is also Director of the Henry Halloran Trust for Urban Research. Her research focuses on intersections between urban planning and the housing system, and she's led and collaborated on a series of studies on aspects of urban policy, housing, sustainability and planning, funded by AHURI, as well as the Australian Research Council and state and local governments. We also welcome John Brockhoff as a respondent following the research presentation. John's the National Policy Manager for the Planning Institute of Australia. He's previously led the technical development of Sydney's metropolitan strategy and formulated New South Wales government policy for urban renewal, employment, lands and the integration of land use and transport. The format for today's webinar will include a research presentation followed by an industry response from John. And after that, I'll facilitate a discussion with our two participants and take your questions from the audience. So feel free to ask a question at any time, and I'll do my best to include it as part of the Q&A discussion. So it's now my pleasure to introduce you to our main presenter for today, Professor Nicole Gurran. Just on mute, Nicole.
Thanks very much, Michael, and apologies everyone who was waiting for me. The interruption was me, and I'm now coming to you from a public space in one of the innovation hubs within the University of Sydney. Thank you very much to AHURI for this invitation to speak, and before I go any further, let me say that I am coming to you from the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and of course I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This piece of work was a collaboration with a huge number of very esteemed researchers, Kath Hulse, Jago Dodson, and Jago will be well known to many people, Madeline Pill, who's now back in the UK, Robin Dowling, and many others. And so I just urge you to check out the report. But I'm going to give a snapshot today of what led to this inquiry and the central conundrum that we deal with, as well as some of the research findings. And of course, the conundrum is that problem that very successful global cities have, is that the more economically successful they are, the higher the demand for housing, and consequently the higher the housing affordability pressures. And this is a phenomenon that applies to New York City, it applies to London, and of course it applies to our cities in Australia, particularly Sydney and Melbourne. And it reflects the economic success and concentration of those two cities. But it may also, and this is what we interrogate in this inquiry, it may also, through the affordability pressures, come to actually be a victim of its own success, if you like. So that's our leaping off point. And so the focus of the inquiry is on a specific aspect of housing affordability and its intersection with productivity. But before I dive into that, let's just get some terms on the table, starting off, of course, with productivity, which can be defined very simply, and this is the working definition that we used in this inquiry, is simply the ratio of economic outputs relative to labour or capital inputs, which is thought to grow in cities through the process of agglomeration. So that clustering of activities, skilled labour, and the knowledge spillovers that produces attracts more firms, who in turn attract workers, which who in turn depend on access to affordable housing, and in particular rental housing, which enables people to relocate to job-rich regions. And of course, affordable rental housing is essential for lower income workers to remain in those places. And so the focus in this particular work was very much on a specific sector of the housing system, Q2 or lower income earners. So those are income earners who are earning between 50 and 80% of the median. Think an income range per year of approximately 38,000 to the top 60s on a household basis. And that's a sector that is extremely critical to our workforce, of course, but has been unable now to access home ownership, and so is dependent on the private rental market. And so this inquiry is looking at the relationship between urban productivity and the availability of affordable rental housing, particularly for that segment of the labour market, knowing its importance to enabling that productivity to continue, and knowing that that you can influence, I guess, labour depth and mobility by either providing affordable homes near jobs or connecting the availability of affordable homes to jobs through transport intersections, or by providing jobs more closely to affordable rental housing. So the inquiry program was structured across 4 projects that talked to each other but dived specifically into some empirical questions, the first of which traced the changing supply of private rental housing, and it updated a longitudinal study looking at the private rental sector over a 20-year period, and asked specifically how capital cities and satellite cities are performing in providing affordable rental housing for Q2 households, and the implications of changes in the supply of that rental housing for the households themselves, but also for labour market, for labour force participation, and then looked at questions around job accessibility and commuting costs. From that empirical basis of the first 2 projects, which I will detail in a little moment, we then looked at the current strategic planning settings and the existing and potential strategic funding interventions that could potentially lever leverage more affordable rental housing choices near places of employment, supporting productivity in that way, and also whether future changes in our economy, future economic opportunities, such as the arrival of the smart city and the innovation economy, might provide new regional or sub-regional employment opportunities and therefore better balance the housing job mismatch, if you like. Just a little bit more on the methods and data sources. There was a national analysis of private rental supply and a national analysis of planning settings, but there was also very grounded analysis also of the availability of private rental supply, of commuting and transport patterns, as well as of the planning and policy settings. And we looked in particular at those two largest cities, the sort of centrifuges of jobs, if you like, Sydney and Melbourne, as well as their interrelationship with satellite cities, Wollongong and Geelong, and their potential the potential opportunities in those satellite cities, both in terms of relieving some of the housing market pressures in Sydney and Melbourne, but also developing economically in their own right. So on to some of the key findings, and I'll start with findings that were highlighted in the first of the research projects led by Kath Hulse and her team, which looked at the changing supply of affordable and available private rental housing. And that's a concept that we need to dive into and understand. So if there's been a housing story, success story, if you like, a housing success story, if you like, if you want to call it that way, there has been tremendous growth in the size of the private rental sector in Australia. We don't have a shortage, actually, of rental housing. The private rental sector grew at more than twice the rate of household growth just in the 5-year period of analysis. I should have said that our study was limited to census data, and so the figures that I'll be citing here are 2011 to 2016. But you can see tremendous growth of private rental sector exceeding housing household growth, and actually, unfortunately, the supply of social housing actually went in the other direction, and we saw smaller growth in home ownership, as people are very familiar with. But notwithstanding the expansion of the private rental sector, we've got an actual shortage of dwellings that are both affordable but also available for those lower income households, and that shortage is at its most extreme in Sydney, and it's been worsening, of course, over the 10-year period of analysis. I should actually explain that concept before I go any further of affordable and available, and the issue arises because of moderate income earners being unable to enter home ownership. So we have a larger private rental sector, but more competition for affordable housing within that, for housing that's affordable to those income groups within that private rental sector. And because the private rental sector is unregulated, of course, we have moderate income earners making the very sensible decision to spend less on their housing, and we also have the unfortunate situation of very low income earners needing to spend more, and that results in a squeeze. And for lower income earners, that squeeze is a deficit of 173,000 dwellings, rental dwellings. Now, it's worse, as I said, in Sydney. Ironic, sort of somewhat counterintuitively, but we'll have a little look at this as I go through the presentation. Affordable rental housing, and by that I don't mean social housing, I mean housing that within the private rental sector is offered for rent at a price that is within the 30% threshold for affordability. The supply of that lower priced rental stock actually increased in outer Melbourne over the period of analysis, and decreased in all parts of Sydney. And as I said, it's explained by this competition this competition for lower priced rental housing by both very low income earners as well as by moderate income earners, all competing for the same limited supply of housing, with the result being this gradual increase in lower income households living in unaffordable rental housing. Now, the shortage, this is a figure that just shows the deficit over time. It's most extreme in Sydney and most extreme in inner and middle Sydney, but it exists across Sydney, and the deficit has grown even though the total stock of technically lower cost rental housing has grown in Melbourne. The deficit has also grown, and to a lesser degree satellite cities such as Wollongong, Geelong and Newcastle, also particular shortages in the Sunshine Coast and other critical regional centres. So now I want to turn to some of our findings in terms of what this means for some of the productivity enablers such as accessibility and participation to job opportunities. And we're looking here at the types of trade-offs that lower income households make in order to either access affordable housing or access employment markets. And here I'm drawing particularly on work led by Jago Dodson and his team, but also some of the analysis undertaken by Kath Hulse. And so this analysis really examined the geography of private rental supply that's affordable, as I said, to lower income workers, and where it is located relative to central city employment opportunities and also relative to employment markets in those satellite cities that we examined as well. And the sort of headline finding, and won't surprise any economists, of course, is that lower paying jobs are located near lower cost housing. So in a sense, you'd say, well, that's market sorting, working. But unfortunately, the supply of both of those are very limited. So the supply of jobs, whether they're lower paying or not, is limited, and so is the supply of lower priced housing. So consequently, we're left with the question, what are lower income renter households doing? Are they commuting further to work? Are they participating less in the workforce, or are they enduring unacceptable and probably unsustainable in the long term levels of housing stress? So this is sort of what it looks like geographically, and you can pore over the maps in the report, but this is simply showing the stark mismatch between the supply of lower cost rental housing. Of course, there's not much of it, but technically affordable is absolutely on the outer fringe of Sydney, but the size of the labour market is, and particularly the professional jobs, but labour markets overall are biggest, obviously, in the areas where there isn't affordable private rental supply. The situation is a little bit different in Melbourne, where there's a little bit more dispersal of job opportunities and also technically affordable rental housing that's affordable to those lower income groups, as I said, but there is still an overall shortage. In Geelong and Wollongong, you actually see quite diverse and self-contained job markets occurring, as well as more affordable rental housing, but those cities, of course, are suffering longer-term looming economic threats and challenges associated with deindustrialisation. And we'll come back to that a little bit at the end. So the question is, as I said, are lower income earners enduring unacceptably long commutes, and of course there are costs associated with that. Are they participating in the workforce less, or are they living in unacceptable and unaffordable housing conditions? It looks like they're doing all of those things, but based on the different circumstances, of course, of those households. So lower income households in Sydney in particular, but also to a lesser degree Melbourne, who are actively engaged in the workforce or seeking work, are trading off affordability for access to jobs. So they are clinging on to inner and middle ring areas of the city, even if they are living in unaffordable housing, and that's what these bars are showing. Another finding, this is from Jago's study, of course, is that even though overall there's a reasonable proximity between where lower income workers are living and working, those that are commuting are paying on average a really significant proportion of their income on their commuting costs, which when you're considering that they're also paying probably around 30% of their income on rent, the commuting costs become very significant. In Melbourne, the story is similar, but a little bit more nuanced, and that, as I said, reflects that more dispersal of jobs and rental homes. So moving on now to our policy settings and the potential transformative power of strategic funding interventions, like city deals, for instance. I'm going to draw, in the first part of my observations here, on a project led by Madeline Pill, and it really looked at strategic planning settings in Australia, as well as the use of those strategic funding interventions, city deals and other types used internationally as well as in Australia. Now, I'm not going to go through our really interesting National Review of Capital Cities Strategic Plans, except to say that the detail is in the report and read it. But those strategic plans are saying the right types of things in terms of we want more housing near jobs, we want to make existing housing more accessible to jobs through transport, investment, and we want to make more jobs near existing and future housing by a combination of the infrastructure needed to encourage jobs as well as the transport interventions. So the sentiment is right. And even the zoning, if you like, in terms of the capacity for new housing development, that's right too. And the policies, as I said, so we've got policies for connectivity, we've got policies for new and protected employment lands. We've been extremely successful, particularly in Sydney, in terms of density. And we also see, as part of regional and sub-regional strategic planning in Australia, an encouragement of jobs growth in sub-regional centres of cities as well as in sub-regional areas. But what we don't see is any requirement for affordable rental housing. And when I say any requirement, yes, there are initiatives around the edges, and please question me about that if you like in the Q&A section, but really it's negligible, as the empirical findings of the inquiry have demonstrated in terms of the level of housing stress that exists. Now, we still hear, and there were several articles in the newspaper even last week in Sydney suggesting that the problem is still one of regulatory barriers to new housing supply. Look, if you didn't enact a single rezoning in Melbourne, there's enough capacity for almost 250,000 new dwellings, not even taking up the existing capacity, just taking it to the 75th centile of density, according to Jago Dodson and his team's figures. And it's not as extreme in Sydney, but certainly even existing levels of land use zoning provide for significant intensity of new housing supply. So that's not the problem at the moment. So what could we do about it, and what's being done overseas? And obviously funding is one of the answers, or a redirection of funding is one of the answers. And there's an increasing appetite, I think, in Australia to look at strategic place-based funding interventions. We call them city deals, and I'll talk about ours briefly in a moment. We're inspired by the UK model of city deals, but there's been a long tradition of this idea of strategic investment in a particular place to deliver joined up solutions around employment, transport and housing packaged by good governance. And the report and the supporting research project led by Madeline Pill details what those types of approaches might look like. But the headline takeaway, again, is that for strategic funding interventions to work, they need very explicit governance arrangements, objectives and performance measurement frameworks. Local government needs additional funding to build their capacity to engage. Now, these deals have tended to focus on infrastructure and often transport infrastructure, which we certainly wouldn't object to at all. In fact, that's often part of the solution. But benefits to disadvantaged groups have often been unclear in these deals, and that in the analysis that Madeline did and the many numbers of people that she interviewed and the research in this space shows that in part that's because of the failure to link infrastructure investment to protecting and providing affordable rental housing. To the extent that housing has been considered in these deals, the emphasis, again, like us in Australia, has been on overall increasing supply, not looking at the impact of investment on the market and actually the potential displacement effects, unfortunately, of these flagship investments as well. So turning now briefly to the Western City deal, and I'm hoping there's some participants who are actually much more expert in the design and the delivery of the Western City deal than I am. You can read about it, of course, in the report and also the wonderful literature that's emerging around that deal. I have to say that all of the interviewees spoken to in the course of this inquiry were actually really positive about the potential for deals like the Western Sydney deal to catalyse new economic opportunities, in this case obviously stimulated by the Aerotropolis, but also the really transformational potentially transport interventions that are associated with the deal itself, and the power to actually look at a particular place and bring together the different agencies involved in and stakeholders involved in planning for that place. But if it's successful, the housing market is going to price out, and worse for renters, who are the focus of this particular inquiry, displace them, because as we see, when places are economically successful, housing markets rise, there's competition in the rental market. So for this deal to deliver real benefits for all of the people and to provide for that critical sector of the workforce into the future, specific affordable housing provisions are needed. They're needed urgently. Now, I'm not going to do justice because I'm nearly at the end, so I won't be doing justice to the report led by Robin Dowling here at the University of Sydney that looked at the intersection between the innovation economy and the availability of affordable rental housing. But one of the takeaway messages that I wanted to highlight, because I think it is really significant to the aspirations that we have for the Aerotropolis in Western Sydney, and certainly for aspirations even right around me here in Redfern in Sydney around innovation, catalysing new economic opportunities, is that the big innovation districts internationally that have been successful have been underpinned by affordable housing. Not only rental housing, but affordable rental housing has been really important. And of course, the places that have been less successful on the affordable rental housing side of, places like Silicon Valley, for instance, that have led to that terrible rental crisis in San Francisco. You know, that's the model that we don't want. And, you know, actually the crisis in housing affordability has actually been seen to constrain the future development of innovation, you know, in that area, and is leading to other innovation areas in other parts, such as Toronto, for instance, starting to really emerge, built around not only investment in universities and all of the transport and all of the things that catalyse innovation, economic investment, but also underpinned by serious investment in affordable housing and affordable rental housing. Oh, before I leave that slide, let me put in a plug for, you know, even Byron Bay in New South Wales, struggling with terrible affordability pressures, has its own little innovation district, which has got some really cool models actually around affordable rental housing. It's sort of a little pocket of hope within, you know, a really grim situation in regional areas. And so just to sort of finish off where I sort of hinted I was going to end up with in relation to the potential role of satellite cities such as Geelong and Wollongong and their challenge in the context of deindustrialisation, the opportunity to reboot and reinvigorate their economies around an innovation economy. Certainly the work undertaken by Robin and her team, and also Madeline and her team, highlighted potential to support that type of exciting activity, but with the proviso again that affordable rental housing is going to need to be built into the fabric of these strategies. So to finish off, sort of to highlight the, I guess, 3 overarching potential policy options that we landed on in this inquiry as a basis for discussion. The first is a spatial policy around improving economic activity, jobs opportunities in places where there are existing affordable rental housing, a kind of concentrated decentralisation strategy that looks to mimic the conditions of successful cities, so the conditions of agglomeration, but packages through packaged investments such as your place-based deal opportunities. Doing that, however, requires preserving and creating affordable areas in places that are benefiting from that investment. And the other strategy, which is not a new strategy, but the findings of this inquiry demonstrate is so absolutely important, is to increase affordable rental supply in key employment areas. Just this morning, an article in the newspaper about a crisis in paramedics in central Sydney. This is a sector of the workforce that simply needs to be near where they work. So the way to increase this affordable rental supply, yes, is inclusionary planning. It's not going to do everything. Build to rent, perhaps, as long as we're requiring an affordable component there. Perhaps use of government land for affordable rental housing, but certainly policy intervention. And the last thing that I want to say is that unlike the overarching housing policy problem that we face in Australia, this bit isn't that hard to deal with because lower income earners pay a lot for their housing and already, so they don't need a lot of subsidy. In fact, there is quite a lot of even Sydney and certainly Melbourne, quite a large area of middle Sydney and Melbourne where rents are just a little bit out of reach. In fact, just 20% out of the reach of a Q2 household. So there are certainly policy models on the table that would provide a discounted and secure rental housing outcome for that sector of the housing system. And, oh, look, last slide of course, we have to reference where we all are. I think COVID, if anything, has certainly reinforced the potential for decentralisation, but also the critical relationship between the availability of rental housing as well as its affordability to support a labour market that's relocating, but also an existing lower income rental market to remain in areas experiencing economic and population growth. And of course, the potential for place-based strategies, both in Sydney but also in regional areas, to really look at those places, not only their connections to the major cities, but their internal connections as well. And I'll leave it there, Michael. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Nicole. That was a really comprehensive look at quite a vast program of research there, and well done bringing that together in difficult circumstances, having evacuated from your office just moments ago. Look, I'd now like to turn to John and I guess get a response from you to the research and to the themes that it represents. John Brockhoff.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks, Nicole. Being from the Planning Institute of Australia, this work is really important. It talks to the strategic planning and housing policy pathways we need to track if we're to make our cities more productive, more resilient and fairer. And if we want to improve urban productivity, we've got to tackle the right problems. And the AHURI paper that Nicole's just presented navigates the phenomenon of our Australian housing market in our cities. And it's a market for shelter as well at the same time as being an attractive investment asset. And I think it's that two-faced nature of our housing market that really throws us, and why we see such vastly different commentary, and how important it is for the work that Nicole's presented and her colleagues to untangle this for public policy makers. This paper, this inquiry and other supporting evidence reinforces our understandings that housing in Australian cities is expensive to live in as a renter and an owner, and that this burden hits hardest on the lower income earners, the Q2 component that Nicole covered. We also appreciate that the implications of so much income being diverted to relatively less productive uses in housing does have implications for the performance of our economy and our cities. And thirdly, we recognise the costs to the economy and individuals of the suboptimal trade-offs that many people who live in our cities and regions are being forced to make, whether that's to spend more on their housing than they're comfortable with, to live further away, to sacrifice amenity, or simply to opt out of the labour market. So I really appreciate the work that Nicole's done to sort of paint this conundrum more clearly for policymakers. The availability of housing choices on where and how to live has an impact on economic productivity at a city scale, but the costs don't fall evenly and disproportionately affect lower income earners who are both under housing stress due to the housing costs, also the commuting costs, but who also are provided an essential pool of labour. The Q2 people are a critical component of driving the machine of our city and regional economies. And there's growing evidence that more untargeted, I suppose, more housing supply, untargeted housing supply alone will not bring the market into balance, and that demand-side investment incentives in housing as an investment product are really great and really do have a distortionary effect. And that's in addition to our demand-side incentives to invest in housing, are in addition to the topic that Nicole introduced with around global city success factors. So this conundrum is at the core of Nicole's team's and AHURI's research, this inquiry, and the work tests some alternative scenarios for a way forward for strategic planning of land use, housing and infrastructure planning and delivery for our cities. And the work challenges us to consider the productivity implications of more housing for certain housing segments near accessible employment nodes with their associated agglomeration economies. So there's that urban restructuring branch of policy intervention. There's that second point she made around more investment in connecting remote or city fringe or satellite, more connecting more remote housing by transport or digital infrastructure investment. And then the other policy pathway that she followed was the strategy of fostering new and decentralized employment clusters, whether they be in the regions or embedded within satellites or in existing cities. And several of those models can be supported by place-based funding. But I guess in every case, the notion of whichever pathway that one follows, whether it be more housing near accessible development, more investment in connections, or new and decentralized employment clusters, it does require an integrated strategic planning attention. There's no point just having city deals willy-nilly all over the place. It's not efficient or effective use of public money. And this is the role of strategic planning at a state scale and even at a national scale. The Planning Institute's talked around a national settlement strategy so that we can look at where we can leverage the important and major interventions for city deals or place infrastructure compacts in places where they can help us get an outcome, whether it's in one of those three pathways, planning pathways that Nicole discussed. But importantly, no one of those three pathways are wrong, and in different places they'll work, and in different places they might not be the dominant planning pathway. But I think it's important for all policymakers and strategic planners, infrastructure investors, to take on some more resilience thinking and look at what are no regrets pathways for the future. It's always possible to adopt a diversity of pathways going forward in your strategies and anticipate a degree of redundancy. It might be for the first 5 years you can take up your supply and near accessible nodes, but in the future you might have to ramp up and get to a threshold where a major investment in a piece of transport infrastructure is more economic. Or there is a time in the future where you can gather the resources and community and government interest around a major deal around a decentralized employment cluster. But all of those things can happen through a resilience lens and considering a diversity of pathways forward in your strategic planning, looking at the times in the future where key decision points will need to be made, and anticipate and acknowledge a degree of redundancy, and that there will be at different points in time pathways become less important and pathways that you have to drop and ones that you can push forward on. But in every case, a degree of city, region, and state and even national coordinated and coherent strategic planning, so that the considerable investment that's needed to line up the ducks for place infrastructure compacts or city deals can be directed in the right direction. So I'd really like to congratulate Nicole's team for really putting out in front of us the options for strategic planning that are available and providing that supporting evidence, particularly around the labour market productivity implications and the sorts of trade-offs we are going to have to consider as we plot a way forward for this country as it grows and changes. So Michael and Nicole, I think it'd be great to have some questions and see what's on offer.
Right. Thanks, John. Let's do exactly that. We've got quite a few coming through from the audience. John, I think you wanted to ask a question or two of Nicole before I open it out, though. Was that your intention? Or should we just go straight to the audience and we can weave that in?
I could. I think you've got questions ready to go, Michael. I think we'll run with those.
Let's do that. So one of the, there's actually a series of questions from different people that are addressing a broad issue here, and I'll try and synthesize them for the sake of clarity. And they're really looking at the key worker issue in particular. Health workers have come up. You mentioned paramedics in your presentation, Nicole. There are several other categories of health worker have been mentioned through the course of the questions, and really that this was once seen as the role of employers, as a responsibility of employers to provide access to housing. Will that come back? We've seen a couple of examples of that overseas. Will governments take on this as a specific priority? What's your crystal ball telling you about that?
Oh, well, my crystal ball is telling me no. But of course, that's why we do work like this, is to try and provide the research evidence to inform a change of policy. At the moment, I don't think there has been an acknowledgement in Australian housing policy and economic policy that housing is critical to labour market needs, and that governments need to intervene to make sure that the critical lower income sector of the workforce is able to access it. I don't think that policy argument has been won, even though I think the weight of evidence is mounting. Will certain firms take the lead on that? I think they probably already are doing that. If you can hear a little mosquito sounding thing in the background, it's a flying drone. It's not going to actually hit me in the head. Anyway, I'll try not to let it distract me. But yeah, certainly, firms that are trying to recruit higher skilled workers will often include a housing package. But unfortunately, it's that critical sector of the labour market that misses out. And unfortunately, we're not seeing schemes put forward by employers or government to, for instance, provide affordable homes for nurses, except in a really limited capacity. And there's been some non-profit leadership in the space. We can say the same for paramedics. We can say the same for teachers, and so on.
Can hear that drone in the background.
I'm going to mute myself in between.
This is the Innovation Hub, and someone's getting a coffee delivered at the moment. So. I guess, just to tease that out a little more, some of the questions are really asking, well, what sort of criteria would you use to approach that? So if you wanted to do more for nurses in a particular location near hospitals or health centres or what have you, how would you go about doing it?
Look, it's actually really simple, given that these generally lower income earners are in the workforce. Lower income households are in the workforce. So the big problem actually is the availability of affordably priced rental housing. So the private rental market is actually producing it, but it's not necessarily available to the households that need it. And then we also have the problem of the private rental sector itself not being a secure long-term housing option. So we've got an issue with the private rental sector not being fit for purpose. Potentially that might be addressed by a build for rent model, provided that the housing quality and the management is of a high standard. But it's the availability of lower of affordable rents that's the other problem. And so, look, the easiest scheme to illustrate a very quick policy intervention is the density bonus scheme that operates in Sydney. Now, you wouldn't need to require a density bonus, but essentially what it says is developers get a density bonus as part of their residential development, as long as they provide affordable rental housing, by which they mean housing that is managed by a non-profit housing provider, community housing provider typically, who then rent that household to that unit to an eligible based on income criteria to an eligible household. And so there's no public subsidy involved in that process. The rent is 20% market discount, which, as our analysis shows, is enough in most parts of in most parts of Middle Sydney even. So it's enough, that 20% discount is enough to make it affordable, but it's the process of setting aside some of the housing for lower income groups that's equally important, and providing long-term tenure. That's as critical, perhaps more critical actually, than providing a subsidy to build the housing.
So Nicole, are you arguing that build to rent can be delivered at an affordable rate without subsidy?
Look,
just to be really specific on that.
If build to rent, if the numbers stack up, if people are able to finance a build to rent product, there's no evidence whatsoever that that couldn't be provided at an affordable rental price. And it may well actually be provided at a lower rental price. It will depend, I guess, on the bells and whistles and, and the product that's offered. So far, we've seen the opposite. So we've seen the build to rent models, which in New South Wales are the new boarding house developments have essentially been a kind of build to rent model because they can't be stratified. I think the best way to think about build to rent is a residential development, typically residential flat development that can't be stratified. And at the moment, the product in the market that's not able to be stratified is boarding houses, and they are rooms as small as 12 square metres for individuals, 16 square metres for couples. But the market is often providing them at, say, 30 square metres and targeting them to young urban professionals. Now, they're high quality finish, which is good. You want that. The design is, okay. But are they affordable? No, they're not coming in at an affordable rent. And are they being rented to people on low income, so our target rental group, well, there's no requirement that they are. So does that answer your question?
Well, yeah, I mean, on behalf of, I suspect it gets a fair way. I guess the other dimension of that is could we look at government subsidy of build to rent as a productivity intervention rather than as a housing intervention per se?
Well, we do that, but we don't do it enough, and it's called social housing, community housing. That is government subsidy for build to rent. It's a very high quality, very good quality, build to rent. It makes a wonderful contribution to the community. Probably certainly stimulates economic growth and construction. But yes, I would argue that it is a productivity input, and that is the only place that we see affordable rental housing targeting the city's key workers, for instance, in inner Sydney. So yes, it is absolutely a productivity intervention.
Nicole, could I ask, are we seeing or is there any evidence out there that access to that type of affordable housing can impact or is impacting on conventional productivity metrics?
What do you mean, John?
Can we see a productivity advantage for the availability of more affordable housing where it's needed?
Look, the sums look like those sums haven't been done, but I would say that if we look at, for instance, the research by Robin and her team and the latest analyses of, for instance, those innovation districts, which are obviously the places that are going to be economically successful. The places that are trending highest on the metrics are places where there's a high number of graduate students, for instance, and graduate students depend on rental housing. So they're those regions where creative and younger sectors of the workforce are able to locate. Those are the typical productivity benefits. The bigger question, will cities like, New York and London and Sydney constrain economically because our teachers can't afford to live near where they work, or our paramedics can't afford to be here? That's a really difficult question to quantify, I would argue, but I would also say that it's probably the wrong question.
Yeah, and those trade-offs and costs are being felt at a household level. It might not be apparent in citywide metrics, but in terms of household budgets, household convenience, and an individual's contribution to the labour market, those differences are very apparent.
And they're not sustainable in the long term either. But, I mean, we've got a natural experiment happening right now in regional Australia where we have firms crying out for workers, but no rental housing to allow workers to relocate to those areas, and where we also see the existing hospitality, staff, retail staff, lower income earners in those regional areas being forced out of their rental housing because of the housing market pressures. And that absolutely, you know, we've got firms in regional Australia, you know, telling us right now that that has an economic impact for them. It's not the, anyway.
Yeah.
We better get to the next question. I think there's a lot.
We do have a few more to get to, and really one for both of you here, I think. And to what extent does the cost of construction drive affordability challenges? You know, should developers or builders be looking at other alternative methods of construction, and how can policy or building codes support those other methods?
John, do you want me to?
Oh, look, the cost of land is the dominant cost. I won't be able to add a lot more to it than that.
I mean, that's absolutely the answer that I was going to give. And of course, we in this inquiry, we're looking at the intersection between productivity and affordable rental housing. And that intersection is that the most productive areas of Australia, of our cities, are the place that productivity makes the land values high. And so however much we innovate with lower priced construction and, you know, however smaller we go, the underlying cost of that housing is going to be expensive because of the productive economy in which it's located. Now, the way to get off that treadmill is to require affordable housing to be provided. And the good news is that because it's not the cost of providing that housing, it's just the rampant land value appreciation. The good news is actually that, again, you don't need government subsidy to just start to moderate the market price of that housing or to subsidise affordable rental housing in key locations, to build, I should say, affordable rental housing in key locations. You just need a sensible policy intervention.
And Nicole, to what extent do you think the sustained growth in the value of land in our major cities can be used as a source to fund affordable housing?
Yeah, I mean, that's the thinking behind inclusionary zoning. Now, it's not the answer. It's inclusionary zoning can't, you know, you never want to fund affordable housing in its entirety on the expectation that land values will continue to rise, because that's just, you know, that just doesn't, that's just inherently unsustainable, but it's also wrong. It doesn't work. But but your point is a good one. It just shows that if land values are high, then the cost to the developer, who often who will acquire the land at the price set by the market, which is construction costs plus profit, that determines the price of the land. And the construction costs, or the project costs, as you know, John, are determined by materials, labour and regulatory requirements. So a requirement around providing a proportion that's affordable to the area's workers, for instance, doesn't actually reduce very much to the total project cost, but to the extent that it does, it actually lowers the price of the land rather than adding to the total cost of the project itself. So that's easier in higher value sites.
The need to you've presented a scenario way of thinking around the planning pathways that we've got forward for our cities and regions. How might those different scenarios play out in regional plans and in infrastructure plans at a state and national level? We've got a lot of interest from Infrastructure Australia and iBodies around Australia to support place outcomes. We've got a lot of interest in amongst planners to reboot the way we do our regional plannings, and indeed there's some interest in only funding where we do city deals where we have the groundwork done for well integrated strategic planning. How might we join the dots with how we do our regional planning and how we sort of plot a course for the different policy alternatives that you've discussed?
Oh, well, that's just a little question, isn't it, John?
Yes.
But look, just starting with big picture, I think as planners, and particularly when we take this, we've seen urban productivity grow in big cities, and I think spatially we've been unwilling to mess with that. We've said, the market has grown in Sydney and Melbourne, that's where the economic growth is. You don't want to mess with that. And I'm actually not saying mess with that. We'll accept that agglomeration economies are happening. But from that starting point, there's been a sort of, you just follow the market in every instance. And that may or may not be the case, but it means that we've thought only about regional areas or only about, say, satellite cities like Geelong or Wollongong, only in terms of their relationship to Sydney and Melbourne. And that's not enough, and it's certainly not what the planners in those areas or those communities say is the secret to their growth and prosperity. So it's about internal connectivity and internal supporting the grain of the innovation that's occurring and the economic growth that's occurring in those areas through really good internal connectivity, and that's often transport. Of course, it's broadband, and it's investment in universities and in hospitals and in all of the types of infrastructure that allow a knowledge economy to grow and flourish. But it's not, and it is connectivity to the major centres, but it's not about setting Newcastle, the Central Coast, Wollongong, Geelong up as dormitory suburbs for Sydney or Melbourne. It's about encouraging growth within them that might be supported or complemented by a high degree of connectivity to the major centres.
Do you think your work will encourage policymakers to take more of a scenario planning approach to an uncertain future, and not just back one horse like plugging growth around agglomeration centres, but might say, well, that might be okay for some places but not everywhere?
I hope so, because I think that is the right way forward. I should say that there's a stream of studies being undertaken by different teams funded through AHURI, actually. I mean, AHURI is not the only organisation funding research in this space, but it's really leading thinking in this area, and there is some more work to come online that I think builds the evidence base for that type of approach, John. And I hope that PIA and industry and policymakers will find it helpful.
Yeah, very much so.
A couple of other questions about almost different aspects of the housing system that I think it's worth airing with you both. Noting the inadequate supply of housing that's affordable to lower income cohorts. What are your views on supply side measures like, for example, NRAS, and their targeting to particular household income levels, and how that could help with affordability for key workers in the longer term?
I presume that question's to me, Michael.
In the first instance, yeah. But I wouldn't mind John's view as well.
All right. Well, I'll do an advertisement for a research, for a study also funded by AHURI, which looked at the National Rental Affordability Scheme, NRAS, which is coming to an end now, and looked at the way that you can incentivise and support affordable rental supply through very modest, actually, tax incentives. And yes, I certainly think that's part of the answer. That was a scheme that it had its limitations, and it provided tax incentives only for 10 years, and those are expiring very soon. Unfortunately, it worked on that 20% rental discount principle that I outlined in this inquiry, and that for this particular sector of the sort of housing needs continuum, which isn't able to meet its needs in the market, but doesn't need significant subsidy, just needs secure access to a secure long-term rental at an affordable price, not significant subsidy. I think a scheme like NRAS is really a good approach in this space. Yeah.
I would have thought they're complementary, that you need an NRAS style scheme, but ultimately it's got to be underpinned by more affordable stock.
Well, I mean that's right, John, and that was really the objective of the NRES, was to incentivise new housing supply, with the proviso that for the first 10 years, 10 years is probably way too short. Thinking, 20, even 30 years in the US has been shown to be too short, but to incentivise the production of new rental housing, as opposed to what we have, which is the negative gearing, which is to incentivise investment in rental housing, but much of it goes to the existing housing stock, so it pushes up demand. And even the proportion that might go to new housing, because of course new housing development is stimulated by housing supply. So it's a roundabout way to stimulate the market to incentivise the production of new housing, but negative gearing might do that a little bit. But even that isn't targeted to people on low income. And of course, the rental housing is not secure either. You're still stuck in the situation of not having long-term rents, for instance, and no protection from eviction.
Thank you both. And just for those not familiar, NRAS is the National Rent Affordability Scheme, or I should say was. And I completely agree. A longer term, more like a 30-year interval would be much more effective. Another sort of dimension that's being asked about through the questions is the views of you both on the role of collaborative housing models, whether it's cooperative housing or co-housing or collaborative design or development models. John, I might ask you first. Do you have views on those approaches and the role they can play?
We simply don't have the sophistication and diversity in the affordable housing market. We need a much more mature, expansive and diverse affordable housing market, and collaborative co-housing is just part of the mix.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think it's really, we've got to be careful, because there are some market players now that are describing themselves as co-housing, and actually, I'm not sure that they would be akin to the kind of cooperative housing models that you'd see in, for instance, Amsterdam or Germany, which is a non-profit or a very limited profit model of housing development. And yes, I think again, to use the housing needs continuum, but to look at households that are further along in the continuum, in as much as they have lower or moderate incomes, and even people on higher incomes who actually are struggling to enter into home ownership, then looking at models of non-market housing development that don't require a lot, maybe even no housing subsidy, or maybe even cross-subsidise people across the income spectrum. I do think we should be doing more work in that space. It does need some policy leadership, and it does need us to, as John says, it needs us to expand the size and the diversity of the non-profit housing sector. And I actually think that the community housing sector is up to support leadership in that space. And we certainly also see niche architecture and design firms as well, who are really interested in getting involved in forms of sort of deliberative and cooperative and non-market forms of housing development. But without policy intervention, they will actually only be able to, they'll be a high cost product until we're able to provide a policy framework to extend that approach to people further down the income continuum.
Thank you. There's a comment here that I'm actually going to read verbatim for you both, for your response. That it could be argued that even more than house prices, the broken planning system, particularly in New South Wales, is constraining supply and adding significant cost to housing. And if we increase the supply of suitably zoned land with DA consents, this would significantly increase supply and bring down costs. So even with zero international migration and no overseas students, we still have a shortage of housing in New South Wales as a consequence of the broken planning system. Comment.
Well, firstly, as supply has increased in New South Wales and elsewhere, we're still finding problems with availability to affordable housing, particularly for the lower quartile income earners. And so more housing isn't fixing the market in the way the respondent described.
I mean, that's really the takeaway finding. If you take away nothing else from this inquiry, it is that we don't have a shortage of housing. In fact, the private rental sector has grown. There is actually, as the person who's written the comment has observed, we've gone backwards in terms of population. So actually the availability of housing stock is better than ever. But the problem is that not one of too few houses actually, but of too few houses for the many lower income earners at the bottom of the market. Now, would a radical liberalisation of planning laws encourage the housing developers to get in there and produce lower priced housing? I mean, the answer again was within our inquiry. There is an abundance of land that is zoned for residential development of all kinds, of detached houses on the urban fringe, of high density towers around train stations. I so wish that was the answer, because if it was, that's what we would have been seeing by now. I think in international terms, Australia's planning system has really straddled a fine line between sort of free-for-all, some would say it is a bit free-for-all, and the really tight planning regulation that you see in many parts of the United States and even the UK. And I say to my colleagues over there, come on, your planning system, actually it is a problem. Now, even in those tightly regulated urban markets, would deregulating their planning systems address their homelessness problem or address their rental housing problem? No, it absolutely wouldn't, because at the bottom of the market, the problem is not a lack of housing units, it's that they are not being provided at the market at a price that people on very low incomes are able to afford. And we would be better off, for instance, to increase rental subsidy for people on low incomes to address their housing affordability problem than to simply say we need more housing supply, in my view. But I don't think we should only increase rental income. Can I keep talking? We need to build more social and affordable housing as well.
Absolutely. So the federal government has been clear that housing is a state issue, but urban productivity of the country is a national economic issue. Is that an angle to engage differently with the federal government in rental affordability challenges?
Well, I'd like to answer that, Michael. Look, it is. I think nationally, there was an article last week by Martin on the stalling of national productivity metrics, and I think the productivity of cities is another front in this that the national government needs to be interested in. How do we have our cities continuing and increasingly adding to national productivity performance? Housing, the angle that Nicole's described, is one. But how we choose where we can have a positive impact through targeted planning and infrastructure investment, including the delivery of affordable housing, how we know where that can be have a productivity advantage, really requires a great joined up thinking by infrastructure, social and land use planners. And there's an opportunity for the next tranche of regional plans around this country to do that, and to provide at a state and territory and national scale, through some form of national settlement strategy, a notion of where is the best bang for your buck for the sorts of place-based interventions that Nicole described earlier around city deals or place-based infrastructure compacts. We need to do that joined up planning to work out where we can invest in those improvements that can affect city productivity. And if we can demonstrate through evidence such as the work that Nicole's team's done that does have an impact on critical productivity metrics for the country, then there's a role for planners, housing people, policymakers to push that one along.
Yeah.
I think one of the issues that we haven't really discussed during the Q&A section is around mandatory inclusionary zoning and how that could drive affordable supply or drive affordable outcomes within supply. Nicole, what's your view on the effectiveness of that approach? Has it been successful? Could it be more successful?
Yeah, absolutely. It's part of the inclusionary zoning is part of the solution. I'll just describe what it is because it's used, the word is used differently in lots of different contexts, but essentially inclusionary zoning simply means a requirement that new development and typically new housing development includes a proportion that's affordable to people on lower incomes, and not only affordable but is actually targeted to them. So it's there are eligibility requirements in place to make sure that they are able to access it. There's all sorts of models in terms of the way that general principle that new housing development in an area should provide affordable homes. There's all different forms of delivery. Some models require fully completed costed units, so those models might deliver a very, very small amount of housing, a very small relative to the need financial contribution towards a local housing program, and those are the models that we see in Central Sydney. So the inclusionary scheme that is in Redfern, Waterloo, in Green Square. People will be familiar with those areas. That not Redfern, Waterloo, sorry, Ultimo Piedmont and Green Square. Those very small historical inclusionary zoning requirements have actually over time contributed to a really significant funding pool for the City West affordable housing developer, who has, if anyone's been around Piedmont, Ultimo or Green Square, will see some really iconic, fantastic, affordable housing developments by City West, and that's been funded via an inclusionary zoning mechanism. Another approach is that used in South Australia, and so it can be applied equally to lower land value areas. And so the South Australian approach simply said that 15% of new housing developments need to be affordable to rent or to buy by eligible households. And so again, the developer isn't paying isn't providing or gifting. They're not gifting the housing. They're simply saying that the eligible household, often a lower or moderate, it will be a lower or moderate income earner, will be paying close to the cost price of the housing, maybe cost price plus some, but it'll be an affordable price which has been locked in since 2005, because land developers and housing developers have been aware of that requirement since that period of time. So the market has adjusted and absorbed it in. Internationally, there's lots of models like that. Yes, I think a requirement like that could work very well for this sector of the workforce, for lower income earners on that sort of 50th to 80th income centile, because you can provide a discounted rent, 20% discounted rent. It's not very different to market rents, but you're also making sure that the unit is allocated to an eligible household as well. So I think there's potential. Not going to solve the problem, but perhaps the better way to think about it is the phenomenal value uplift that we see, and that we've continued to see in cities when land is rezoned or when planning rules are changed, and even just by virtue of most residential developments, and that is only being captured by the landholder and the developer, and it's not returning anything at all back to the community. So,
yeah, I'd like to add to that, Michael, and that's the mandatory inclusionary zoning fundamentally is funding affordable housing from the cost of from a changing pattern of cost of raw land. and that, you know, if it's transitioned in and if it's widespread and clearly and coherently followed through as a policy, and it applies coherently over an area, then the price that a developer or a proponent of a development pays will be less because of the knowledge that they have of the requirement to include a component of affordable housing. So the question is, can the cost of raw land change, and understandings of what it's worth in the market be widely understood and accommodate the price of affordable housing? The value of raw land has gone up through no work on behalf of the owner. In most cases, it's gone up because of external factors, some of which are planning related, some of which are to do with the maturity of cities and their labour markets, some of which are to do with infrastructure investment in the vicinity. And all of these things that have improved the net worth of our cities have meant that landowners have had their land increase in value considerably. And the question of whether or not some of that value in land can be used to provide and fund affordable housing is really at the centre of how mandatory inclusionary zoning works.
Look, we have reached the end of our time slot for this webinar, I'm afraid. There's plenty more we could have talked about, lots more questions we didn't get to around low interest rates, capital gain, asset appreciation, shared equity, dimensions of productivity, and how to understand that in a range of ways. So lots of questions we didn't get to, and my apologies to all of the people who asked terrific questions that I didn't manage to air. But time has beaten us again. Look, I want to thank all of you for joining us today. We're presently hosting these webinars on a monthly basis. The next one will be announced shortly. So if you want to make sure you get that invitation in your email, make sure you're subscribed to the AHURI News emails. And a quick reminder that we'd appreciate your feedback by completing our short survey that'll be sent to you any moment now. If you want to share this webinar with your colleagues, it'll be on the website shortly. So until we see you again, thank you very much to Nicole Gurran and to John Brockhoff, and to all of you for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.